Runaway. Kristen did not run away. She was abducted and taken, period.
This is where Kristen fell into this dark world of child exploitation and child sex slavery.
Her family is desperate for answers.
It's just the lack of response and return phone calls of our local law enforcement. It's appalling.
Unless it's your own daughter, nobody cares.
This episode of Disappeared retraces Kristen's last known steps.
Finding out that Kristen was on Bissonnet was devastating. That kind of evil lurks out there. We're talking murders, prostitution, everything.
Kristen was coerced. Kristen was lured. It's every parent's worst nightmare. I'm living. I've got to find my baby.
The more people who know Kristen's story, the greater the chance of bringing her home.
I'm Robin Corey. Kristen Galvan is my daughter. Kristen was 15 years old when she disappeared on January 2nd, 2020, in Montgomery County, Texas. She was visiting her grandmother, and she is originally from Houston, Texas, born and raised. Growing up, she was just the light of the world. She'd walk into any room, and she kind of looked like Shirley Temple, if you will, with those little curls and just natural bounds. She loved Elvis. She'd go and dress up just like Elvis and do I'm all sugar. She was definitely a character. Kristen has two little brothers, and she loves her brothers so much. Kristen is passionate about her family, her friends, but Kristen's father has not been in the picture since she was 3 years old. Charles came into Kristen's life when she was 10 years old.
I'm Charles Corey. I am Kristen Galvan's stepfather. She was just really playful, laughed a lot. You know, just kids that age, they don't have a lot of worries. Kristen always had a smile on her face, for sure.
Kristen was gifted and talented since 3rd grade. She loved to sing. She had a voice of an angel. And we had a very strict schedule in our family. You know, school, Girl Scouts, some sort of sport activity home.
In the mornings, you know, my wife would, cook breakfast, and we'd have pancakes, and it would just be that good energy of just, hey, what's your plans for the day? Kiki, I call her Kiki. She loved school. When she was younger, but high school was when it started kind of going downhill.
At the end of freshman year, she did start to act kind of different, more and more pulled back from the family. So in 2019, when Kristen started her sophomore year, Kristen did have a shift change in her friends. And that's when Kristen began to skip class.
It just seemed like typical teenage behavior. She started getting involved with the wrong people, you know what I mean? She started acting out, being on her phone a lot and doing stuff on her phone.
She'd skip school, and I said, Kristen, give me your phone. You cannot have social media without me having the passwords. And I began pulling apart her Instagram messages. It was people in her high school, but older. These boys just seemed like a bunch of gangsters. And these were new friendships full of empty promises. Literally, hey, we'll buy you a Louis Vuitton bag. I just thought it was a really, bad boyfriend. And we needed to get her away from him.
Robin had found some stuff on the phone that she wasn't gonna put up with, and confronted her about it. And it was a big fight over the phone.
November 1st of 2019, we woke up, she was gone. There was a note from Kristen saying that she was going to make her own way. Don't look for her.
Well, from the letter, she was saying she wants to go get money, and that this is what she wants to do, and she's gonna handle it and all this, and talking all this jive talk. She was 15 years old. She shouldn't be doing that.
So I started calling her phone. Of course, I was blocked. I went to log in into her social media, and her passwords had changed. And I'm calling the police. The cops said she's a runaway. She'll come back home.
They literally didn't do anything. It makes you feel terrible because you can't do anything, hopeless.
When I saw that note, I almost knew somebody was in her ear. I had it in my gut. It was a complete nightmare. I was scared. After a week and a half, my phone starts ringing. It was Houston Police Department. And he said, you know, are you Robin, mother of Kristen? I said, yes, sir. He said, well, we have her. And he said, we picked her up on Bissonnet Street. And I'm thinking, picked her up on Bissonnet Street? And he said, well, ma'am, we'll talk about that later. We want you to meet us at Texas Children's Hospital. I go to Texas Children's Hospital, and there's police officers. And then I see my daughter. Kristen's just in tears, bruised, pale. Her hair wasn't brushed. She had nails out to about here. And she also had $4,000 cash on her. And that's when the police officer said, we think she's been trafficked.
My name is Caitlin Monty. I was a local journalist and news anchor in Houston, and I was the first person to cover Kristen Galvan's case. Houston has a huge black eye called Bissonnet Street. People refer to it as the Blade. It's essentially Houston's red light district. Easily, any given night, you could see anywhere from 10 to several dozen young women and men who are out on the street. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of people being trafficked. Human trafficking is when young men and young women are sold for sex or sex acts, usually by a group of men. Houston police picked Kristen up on Bissonnet when they recognized that she was clearly a minor and not able to be consenting to performing sex work.
Finding out that Kristen was on Bissonnet was devastating, crushing. That kind of evil lurks out there. We're talking murders, prostitution, everything.
By the end of the hospital trip, as a mother, I'm thinking, do I bring her home with me? We decided it best her to go live with my parents. It was up in, Montgomery County in the Woodlands.
Montgomery County is 40 miles outside of Houston and considered a really safe and appealing area, particularly for families. So it's very reasonable that that would be a much better place for someone like Kristen to go, particularly if you knew that there was issues related to her having anything to do or any ties to Bissonnet.
So when Kristen, went to my mom's house, it's an hour and a half away. I was still calling her every day, and I was still going pretty much every day to go see her. I had to keep Kristen away from her brothers because I don't want them to see all this drama. It took her a couple weeks to really start to come forth, but she later opened up and told me everything. Kristen said her boyfriend told her to write a nice, lovely note. It was all planned. Her boyfriend would buy her bags, but she said it turned dark so quick, Mom. She said he drove me out there on Bissonnet Street, and Kristen said she had to sleep with 20 guys a day. If you didn't have that money, it was hell to pay. She's like, Mom, what they did to me was wrong. Like, I really thought he loved me.
Traffickers use what's called the Romeo effect, which is sort of a romantic relationship. It doesn't start off as a threat. And then it's not until you get too deep that you realize, I can't get out of this.
Before she went missing, Kristen claimed this boy as her boyfriend. And he told her, hey, I'm gonna buy you the world. You're so beautiful. You're gorgeous. You deserve the world. I'm gonna give you the world. Flattering her and kind of grooming her to believe this. And I just didn't hit it at the time. I knew he was bad. Every red flag was there.
She literally said, you do not know what these people did to me. You have no clue what these people did to me. She wasn't the same person, in her eyes.
She'd wake up shaking, crying, sweating. This kid was sweating profusely, screaming with her nightmares.
These guys have really gotten her head, basically like brainwashing.
So we called Vice, we called HPD, and they came down, got more statements. We gave them the phone. I believed that these detectives were doing the best of their ability to get these traffickers so this wouldn't happen again or to anybody else. I had no clue what was about to come. The psychiatry appointments began pretty quickly. We started therapy, and she finally began to write in her journal. She started to feel better about herself. You could see kind of, the light coming back into her eyes, and she was visiting with her brothers more, and she was making so much progress. So Christmas time was good. Kristen was planning to go back to school in January to a different school, of course, and to get back into school, she needed a phone. So we thought it was time to, maybe it's time for you to have your phone back. And we were monitoring her on it. It was in the kitchen. She couldn't have it at all at night.
I was 100% nervous about giving her the phone back because she was highly influenced.
January 1st of 2020. We were at my mom's house. We had had our New Year's meal, and it seemed like a pretty, normal day. She seemed okay. So I was planning on coming back the next day and seeing her. My dad woke up the next day and she was gone. Kristen did not leave any notes this time. Kristen did not leave any indication of anything. She was just gone. How am I gonna find my daughter? My baby's missing, and I'm panicking. And what do I do as a parent? Kristen took her phone with her. We tried to call Kristen's phone, but I was blocked.
We only had her for like a month and a half, and she's gone again.
When she was rescued that first time, she was scared for her life. She was so persistent. She's like, y'all don't understand. I have to go. They're going to kill you all. They know where you live. They know where Grandma lives. Mom, I have to go.
Once you are tapped by this dark underworld of human trafficking and sex trafficking, it is hard to get away from this network. This is not just one pimp who comes, meets you, and takes you down to Bissonnet. These individuals work for essentially a mob, and that network is very powerful and terrifying, and so it is really hard to feel safe again. And many young women and men who get pulled into sex trafficking will return to it over and over because they don't see any way out, and they're threatened that their families and their loved ones could be harmed if they were to leave or do anything that would impact the business. When Kristen went missing the second time, Kristen's boyfriend was in custody. So he insists he has no idea what happened. But it is easy for the sex trafficking ring to put a new pimp in place when you arrest one. So it's possible that Kristen was lured back by someone within her boyfriend's sex trafficking network.
Of course she was scared. Of course she's upset. She's a little tiny girl. She's a little girl. She don't know anything else. She was lured and brainwashed. And when you're a young girl like that, you're influenceable. You go off like what people tell you. And if you're being led this way, I mean, that's the way you're gonna go. I couldn't believe that the police didn't offer her protection.
I was scared that Kristen was lured back to these men because she got her phone back.
It's estimated that trafficking victims can be recovered by their traffickers as many as 7 times because they have an investment in you.
Kristen was coerced. Kristen was lured. Kristen was groomed.
She might have left the house because she wanted to protect her family. She might have left the house because she was lured out by the same psychological tricks that lured her the first time. We don't know. We don't know why she left the house, but we know that she has not been seen since.
I was scared. So we reported her immediately missing. I did make that flyer, but the police wrote her off as a runaway. Kristen did not run away. She was abducted and taken, period.
She's a young 15-year-old girl that has just been sexually assaulted by multiple men, and you have evidence of this. Like, why wouldn't you take action?
I mean, the logical thing to do would be go to Bissonnet, right? So I'm trying to figure out this, that, and get police to move. That's when I'm like, I'm gonna go there myself. January 3rd of 2020 was the first time I actually went to Bissonnet Street. What is a middle-aged soccer mom who clearly looks like a mom, you know, doing on Bissonnet with a big red Jeep? You got people watching you. I go down there with a bulletproof vest. I was even paying homeless people out there to be my lookout.
That's Mama Bear. We'd go out there and she'd make me drive over and over again, around and around and around the streets, the strip, to try to find her. And she wasn't there. You see half-naked girls, you see cops not doing anything, and you see a long line of cars just waiting to have one of these girls get into their car.
I was showing the convenience stores, hey, have you seen her? Can I put her picture up? Nobody would let me put her picture up at all in that area. Nobody. This is organized crime at its finest. And they were all scared. Like, I would show them Kristen's picture, oh, you're in some deep shit. Like, this is the stuff I got from people in that area.
At this point, Kristen had been missing for a year. The police definitely need to be doing more or anything. We're literally casing out the place, you know? We're trying to take it in our own hands because we call law enforcement, the feds, FBI, we call everybody. Nobody helps us, nobody cares. Unless it's your own daughter, nobody cares.
It's just the lack of response and return phone calls of our local law enforcement, our officials, and people I need to speak to. It's appalling. These people avoid me like I'm a plague. And the silence is deafening. And so that's when I found Betty.
My name is Betty Simons. I'm a private investigator, and I became involved in Kristen's case in early 2021 after Robin reached out to me. I've made it my life work to help victims of sex trafficking because it hits close home to me. My sister was sex trafficked at 14 years old, and eventually it led to her murder. I'm able to keep her memory alive by helping girls who are victims of this horrible crime. I've actually recovered 46 missing and exploited children. Somebody has to step up and somebody has to help these children. Our law enforcement is very understaffed. There's only 7 detectives in HPD for missing people. You're talking over 8,000 people reported missing a year and only 7 detectives to work it. When I first learned about Kristen's disappearance, you know, my first initial gut reaction is, what have the police done? Who's the detective in charge? What is going on? Do we have any leads, or is there any which way we're kind of going on this case? What are the cops saying? What is law enforcement saying? I personally had talked to somebody in HPD that I trust and I have a good relationship with, and when I asked him, what's going on with the Kristen Galvan case, his response was, who?
And I began to give Betty everything I had. And she began to really help me put some pieces together, finally, that law enforcement should have been doing. And I made Justice for Kristen. It's a Facebook group.
So once I got Kristen's case, I'm hitting social media. I'm looking through online ads. I am following these known traffickers and their girls and trying to see if I can just get a glimpse of Kristen. There are hundreds of escort websites, and so what we've learned is how to kind of limit those down.
It's estimated around 300,000 ads are placed every single day, so no one could go through all of those, but there are softwares like Traffic Jam that are able to use AI to scan all of these ads and all over the internet to figure out not only where are these ads being placed, but whose face is in them. Through technology like this, we have a better chance of getting through more of them and hopefully identifying more young women and young men who may be being advertised and sold.
In February of 2021, I actually sat down and had a meeting with a trusted source I had in Houston Police Department. And so I gave him Kristen's picture and he said, you know, let me help. And just 2 days later, they had a hit on traffic jam, which they believe could have been Kristen.
I know every freckle on my daughter's body. I know every birthmark. And then I look at the face that the Houston DA sent me, and I mean, my heart dropped. And they also sent me another photo of her hands. And so the hands looked like hers. I was like, that's Kristen. That's Kristen. Where is she? We gotta go get her. So that was taken in Atlanta, Georgia, and Kristen was being sold for $10,000 per night. And so at that point, that's when Kristen's case became a FBI case. Because now we have evidence that she has crossed state lines. But I'm still gonna go there myself. And so on February 8th of 2021, I flew to Atlanta. And you know, each huge city has a Bissonnet. And Atlanta's very dangerous. And I'm thinking we're gonna find her in Atlanta. This is it.
When we got the hit for traffic jam, we saw that 2 other young girls were in the ads with Kristen. As Robin's in Georgia, I'm back home in Houston, really trying to locate the other 2 girls and figure out who they really were, their names, and doing the research on that back end.
So I'm in Atlanta. We're passing out flyers. I'm talking to everybody. And they claim they just didn't have any idea who that was. And they're pretty much pleading the fifth on it.
I was able to talk to both girls in the ads with Kristen via FaceTime, and I showed them Kristen's picture, and they said, yeah, she looks a lot like her, but that's not her. And so they showed me the other girl's social media, and the resemblance was so similar, but it wasn't Kristen.
I talked to Betty, and I come back to Houston in tears. Getting on that plane, going from Georgia to Houston, I was just completely heartbroken.
Even though you have these softwares that are extremely accurate and very beneficial, they're not 100%. And so if somebody has a similar facial feature or hair, it may pick up as being that individual or that victim, and it's unfortunately just not. Right now, we're actually headed to what we call the Bissonnet track, or the Blade, as they call it. Usually out here, you'll see on average 25 to 35 trafficking victims that typically work this blade in this particular track. They're living out of hotels, and so they're able to move around at the drop of a dime. So we'll see the same girls for, a couple of months, and then next thing you know, they'll move over into Vegas, and then they'll go, into Florida. And so they kind of make their way around the U.S. They are traveling a lot. And then, we won't see them for several months, and then they'll come back around and we'll see them back in Houston. And so we have to keep looking for Kristen.
On April 24th of 2021, I receive a tip on Facebook from a Latasha Robinson here in Houston, saying that Kristen is locked up in a house here in Houston. So Latasha was trafficked and she escaped. And this woman literally tells me things about my daughter nobody else knew. She knew Kristen sang. And that she had the most amazing voice.
She gave us addresses and very detailed information. And so as the information's coming in, it seemed extremely credible.
Latasha Robinson said that there was 4 girls locked in this house here in Houston. They were all pregnant. Kristen is pregnant. Latasha Robinson said that if the girls tried to run, they would kill their families. She gave me the location of this house. I looked up the house, and it had burglar bars on the inside and outside, just like she described.
And so we decided to actually go and watch this address that we thought Kristen was being trafficked out of. At that point, we set up surveillance. We ran approximately 12 hours worth of surveillance on the residence. During our surveillance, we didn't see any kind of activity that would indicate that a trafficking ring was going on there. There was no out of the ordinary vehicles coming and going. There's just nothing really out of the ordinary. And so as we continued that investigation, we eventually learned that a small family was residing in the home. And so there was no trafficking going on. So at that point, my suspicions start rising. I really want to look into this Latasha and who she is and where her claims are coming from. And so I began to investigate her personally. I quickly found out that Latasha unfortunately did have an addiction problem, that the person she was claiming was Kristen and her trafficker is actually an ex-husband of hers.
Who's gonna make up, hey, your baby's over here locked up in a house? There's gotta be something mentally wrong if you do that.
In my experience as a private investigator, I think Latasha's motive could have been anywhere from a revenge and unfortunately using an innocent family like Robin to get her revenge on an ex-boyfriend. I don't feel like she was in it for any kind of a money or financial gain, but I do believe it was just a ploy.
The FBI has issued warnings about the level of scams that families of missing persons get subjected to. It's unfortunately far too common.
It makes you feel relief at first. Like, thank God she wasn't chained in this basement. Thank God this stuff wasn't real. You know, it really does. It gives you relief that there's still hope, that she's still out there, and that she's okay.
It's devastating, and, you know, a mother is desperate to find her child. And so she's gonna hold on to any lead that comes in, but on an investigative standpoint, we have no choice but to drop that and move on. I think being a private investigator, that's the hardest part of the job, is having to see that devastation in a family's face and watch them break down time and time again, tip after tip. Kristen's case is literally the most challenging case I've ever worked.
So June 1st, I get a Facebook Messenger message from Kristen saying, "Mom, it's me. I need you to go get my baby. They made me dump him in a porta potty. He is a Hispanic baby. Mom, please go get your grandbaby."
Maybe Latasha was telling the truth about Kristen's pregnancy after all, because it's totally reasonable that someone who's being sex trafficked might be forced to get rid of the baby, even if the baby had been born healthy and full term.
And then I immediately did a simple Google search, and this news article had come up that there was a newborn found in a porta potty in Houston. It was a complete nightmare. I was a mess.
Kristen Galvan was last seen January 2nd, 2020. If you have any information, please contact the Houston FBI at 713-693-5000.
When I saw that dead baby found in a porta potty in Houston, it was crazy. Here I am again, calling FBI because feds don't mess with that kind of stuff.
Breaking news out of Northeast Harris County. That's where deputies say they found the body of a deceased newborn inside a porta potty.
So FBI steps in and they're gonna come do a DNA swab. So this is my first time doing DNA. on what could possibly be Kristen's baby, my grandchild. And just that panic. And being there knowing there's a dead baby sitting in the medical examiner's office that could possibly be Kristen's.
But we're literally having to live this nightmare and go down there and wait for months. It takes months to get results for these kind of things.
DNA in this case takes so long because you are talking about a crime scene. This is a deceased infant, and so they have to make sure that they have followed every policy and protocol to make sure if anything is found that it is admissible in court.
August of 2021, FBI sent me a message and said that Latasha is the one who had sent those messages to me. I reached back out to Latasha. No response. And something in my gut said go to her profile, so I did. And Latasha had died.
I'm not 100% sure if she overdosed. Somebody said a brain aneurysm. There's been multiple stories. Eventually, she died. I do not believe it had anything to do with Kristen's case.
I've been lied to a lot. So up, really. And my baby's still missing. I received a message 5 months later from FBI saying that I was not Kristen's baby.
So at this point, we're at the 2-year mark now. And I'm still checking ads. It has become a nightly routine for the last 2 years. And that's to check ads every night, multiple different cities, our bigger trafficking hotspots. Nothing is hitting with Kristen. Could she still be trafficked? Well, no, because she's not being sold. So there's no advertisement going on. Kristen, at the end of the day, to these traffickers, were a product. She was a product to be sold. And if that product is not being advertised, then the likelihood of it being sold is pretty small. So at this point, I did not believe Kristen was being trafficked anymore.
The fact that Kristen's been missing this long, you can't rule out foul play at this point.
So with Kristen not being advertised, it begins to make me wonder, is there another avenue? Is it possible that Kristen is no longer with us? And, could she have been killed? This is a very dangerous industry. And so that, we start to theorize, like, maybe the reason we're not seeing Kristen is because Kristen's no longer with us. I chose not to share my thoughts with the family because I didn't know it to be a fact. Robin's not willing to give up, and so you got to start asking your questions. What did I miss? Is there something I'm overlooking? You're talking 2 years and nothing. So I really kind of start to theorize. What could have happened? Maybe we were looking at Kristen's case all wrong the whole time. I knew we had to go back to square one. Let's go back from the day she disappeared. What was the one key factor in Kristen's disappearance? The phone. When I first got involved, Robin sent me the cell phone records, but at that point, we're thinking Kristen was with the trafficker, and so she didn't have the phone anymore, and the phone wasn't relevant. That was the one key factor I overlooked because I was so focused on believing Kristen was still being sold. So I took the cell phone records. I started figuring out who Kristen was talking to after her disappearance. Where did these numbers belong? Who are they in relation to Kristen? And I realized that we had a couple of Johns on there. And Johns are overlooked by law enforcement.
John refers to someone who is purchasing sex acts from someone, when often from those who are too young to consent. So this person knows they're breaking the law.
We focus so much of our energy and our time on the pimps, and really what we've seen is it's the Johns that are more dangerous. It's the pimps that are manipulating and abusing these victims But the Johns are the ones that are deadly, because a pimp isn't going to kill his money, right? Why would you kill your money? Even in Kristen's case, we had focused so hard on the traffickers, and not once did we ever turn and focus on these Johns. So we began to separate the cell phone records and backtrack the phone numbers. One in particular caught our attention. It was the very last person that Kristen ever talked to on that cell phone. And I think that's when it hit me that the answer may have been in front of us the whole time. There were several messages with the John, back and forth over a couple of day period that Kristen had been gone. And so we knew we at least had a timeline of who was the last person to have spoken to Kristen. And I was able to track down the John. He was not very forthcoming with information. He seemed to have a lot to hide. And every time I would talk to him, his story would change again. And so that was very suspicious. And why would your story change? You know, it's not hard to remember the truth.
And so help me God, if this man did hurt my daughter, oh man, Houston will have hell to pay.
I recently handed all this information over to the FBI because Kristen's disappearance is an open investigation. But what I do know is whatever happened to Kristen, she does deserve justice.
So the case is still open, but it's been 3 years and not much has changed in terms of what we know about Kristen's disappearance. However, we know that before Kristen went missing, Kristen was working with police and wanted to help end what was happening.
Kristen is 19 years old now. Her birthday just passed. We went to the beach. Kristen loves the beach. She would always say, my favorite place is where the ocean meets the sky. And I'm like, yes, me too, baby, me too. So I went to the ocean. Then I released some balloons. We had supper there and just, you know, a good family day. But the just not knowing. I think it's been long enough. I need some answers, and I think he deserves some answers. You know, at this point, you know, I'm gonna continue to go out there, help families, help them find their children, and continue fighting to expose what's going on here in Houston. It's not just my baby being sold.
My sister was actually trafficked out on Bissonnet. So she was 14 years old when she first met her trafficker, and she was recruited out of what we call Chimney Rock, which is a CPS facility right up the road.
And we know that the last sighting of Kristen was actually right here too. And this street, this blade, this track right here is very significant to Kristen's story. This is where her traffickers trafficked her. This is where they sold her. This is where, you know, Kristen fell into this dark world of child exploitation and child sex slavery, literally right here.
We don't know what happened to her, but we know it started here. We don't know why Kristen decided to leave her house the second time. Is Kristen alive? Kids don't just fall off the face of the planet. As long as there's some sliver of hope, I'm not willing to give up.
It's been 3.5 years, and we pray for her safe return. I believe Kiki is out there and that we will be reunited with her soon.
She's there, she's out there somewhere.
There are cities that remember everything. Not because they choose to, but because they have no other choice. Every layer of brick, every worn cobblestone, every silent stretch of river carries the weight of footsteps that disappeared long before anyone thought to count them. London, in the closing decades of the 19th century, was one of those cities. It was a place where wealth and misery lived only streets apart, where grand government buildings cast long shadows over neighborhoods filled with hunger, where smoke from factories blurred the skyline until morning and night seemed to melt into one another. Beneath the confident face of the British Empire, another London existed, one that rarely appeared in paintings or official reports. It breathed through narrow alleys soaked by rain, crowded lodging houses where strangers slept shoulder to shoulder, crowded docks where laborers fought for a day's wage, and the slow, dark current of the River Thames, a river that carried commerce by daylight and secrets after dusk. The Thames was never silent. Even in the deepest hours of the night, barges drifted across its surface, ropes strained against wooden posts, distant whistles echoed through the mist, and water slapped patiently against stone embankments that had watched centuries pass. To those who worked the river, every sound meant something. A loose chain. A shifting tide. A boat changing course. The men who spent their lives navigating these waters learned to read the river almost as if it possessed a language of its own. It revealed lost cargo. It returned forgotten possessions. Sometimes it surrendered the bodies of those who had fallen into its depths. Death was not unfamiliar here. Accidents happened. Suicides happened. Illness claimed lives without warning. The river accepted them all with the same indifferent rhythm. But every so often, the Thames gave something back that did not belong to any ordinary tragedy. It began without headlines. Without public panic. Without anyone realizing that history was quietly turning another page. A man working along the river noticed what appeared to be nothing more than a bundle drifting with the tide. It was wrapped, heavy enough to resist the current but light enough to keep moving with it, rising and sinking as the water carried it toward the muddy shoreline. There was nothing remarkable about discarded bundles in Victorian London. Refuse floated everywhere. Broken crates, spoiled food, scraps of cloth, dead animals. Rivers collected what cities wanted to forget. The man reached for it almost absent-mindedly. For a brief moment, the world remained ordinary. Then the wrapping loosened. Everything changed. The object inside was not cargo. It was not an animal. It was part of a human body. The river continued flowing exactly as it had only seconds before. Boats still drifted across the water. The morning air remained cold enough to sting the lungs. Somewhere in the distance, church bells announced another ordinary day. Nature offered no acknowledgement that horror had entered the scene. The current did not slow. The wind did not stop. London simply kept moving. The discovery itself would have been enough to disturb even experienced policemen. Death, after all, was expected. Murder was not unheard of. Yet there was something profoundly unsettling about what lay inside that bundle. It suggested preparation rather than impulse. Deliberation instead of rage. Whoever had placed it into the river had not acted in haste. Time had been taken. Decisions had been made. Every movement carried intention. As word spread through the local authorities, questions arrived faster than answers. Whose body was this? Where had she died? How had she come to rest in the Thames? Why had only part of her been found? Each question led only to another. The city had no shortage of missing people. Women vanished with alarming frequency in Victorian London. Some left abusive homes. Some searched for work in unfamiliar districts. Others drifted into poverty so severe that no family remained to report their disappearance. Domestic servants changed employers without leaving records. Sex workers often lived beyond the attention of official institutions. Migrants arrived every week hoping for opportunity and disappeared just as quietly into overcrowded neighborhoods. Entire lives could fade away without generating more than a passing remark from a landlord or a coworker. If someone wished to erase a person completely, London provided countless opportunities. The police understood this better than anyone. Their resources were limited by modern standards. Fingerprint identification had not yet become routine. DNA analysis belonged to a future nobody could imagine. Surveillance did not exist. Communication between districts moved slowly, and records were often incomplete. Detectives relied on conversations, observation, memory, and persistence. They knocked on doors. They questioned dockworkers, lodging housekeepers, publicans, physicians, butchers, anyone who might recognize a face or recall an unusual event. Sometimes they succeeded. Often they found themselves chasing rumors that dissolved the moment they reached them. This investigation promised something even more frustrating. There was no face to recognize. No expression frozen in death. No witness who could confidently say, "I saw her yesterday." Identity itself had been stripped away. That single fact transformed a murder into something far more difficult. Before investigators could hunt a killer, they first had to discover who had been killed. Without a name, every possibility remained open. Every missing woman in London became a potential victim. Every unanswered report demanded another exhausting inquiry. Yet the greatest mystery did not lie with the victim alone. It lay with whoever had done this. Early examinations revealed details that disturbed even seasoned medical observers. The body had not simply been mutilated in blind violence. There were indications of method, of familiarity. The cuts suggested someone who understood how a human body could be separated efficiently. Whether that knowledge came from medical practice, slaughterhouses, or another profession entirely remained uncertain, but the distinction mattered. Random brutality often left chaos behind. Skill left patterns. Patterns frightened investigators. Patterns suggested experience. Experience suggested repetition. At first, nobody wanted to imagine what that possibility meant. London had witnessed notorious murders before. Public executions remained part of living memory. Newspapers eagerly covered crimes that combined violence with mystery, knowing readers devoured every detail over breakfast tables and in crowded pubs. Yet even against that grim background, this case felt different. It possessed an unsettling absence of emotion. There were no signs of a struggle visible where the remains appeared. No dramatic confrontation witnessed by horrified neighbors. No blood-soaked room discovered by accident. Only fragments, carefully removed from wherever death had actually occurred and scattered across a city large enough to conceal almost anything. The murderer seemed to understand geography as well as anatomy. The Thames connected districts that otherwise felt worlds apart. It threaded through industrial docks, elegant government buildings, crowded markets, warehouses, factories, and forgotten marshes before continuing eastward toward the sea. Anything released into its waters could travel surprising distances depending on the tide. A person familiar with those rhythms possessed advantages unavailable to ordinary citizens. The river could become transportation. It could become concealment. It could become an accomplice incapable of testimony. For generations, Londoners had spoken about the Thames with a strange mixture of dependence and suspicion. It fed the city's economy, supplied employment, linked neighborhoods, and welcomed ships from across the world. Yet it also concealed what settled beneath its surface. Mud swallowed evidence. Currents altered timelines. Water erased traces that land preserved. If someone intended to hide a crime, there were few places more forgiving. Still, one discovery alone did not create a legend. One investigation alone did not reshape history. What nobody standing along that riverbank could possibly know was that the bundle drifting through the current represented only the beginning of a nightmare that would unfold over the next several years. More discoveries would follow. More unidentified women. More carefully separated remains appearing in places that seemed chosen with disturbing confidence. Detectives would begin noticing similarities impossible to dismiss. Journalists would search for connections. Ordinary citizens would wonder whether an invisible predator was moving through the capital while everyone watched another, far more famous killer dominate newspaper headlines. History would remember the Whitechapel murders. But while public attention remained fixed on streets illuminated by gaslight and terror, another mystery flowed quietly beneath the bridges of London, carried by the same river that had witnessed the rise of an empire. It asked different questions. It left different clues. And more than a century later, despite advances in forensic science beyond anything Victorian investigators could have imagined, those questions remain unanswered. Some crimes fade because time erases them. Others endure because time never manages to explain them. The Thames Torso murders belong to the second kind. They survive not simply because they were brutal, but because they exposed how easily a person could disappear inside one of the largest cities on Earth, leaving behind only fragments, unanswered questions, and a river that never revealed everything it knew. Morning arrived differently along the Thames than it did in the grand avenues of Westminster or the fashionable squares of Kensington. Dawn did not begin with sunlight spilling across polished windows. It arrived as a gradual lifting of grey, a reluctant surrender of darkness to an even paler shade of cloud. Smoke from factories blended with the river fog until the horizon dissolved into a blurred line where water and sky became impossible to separate. Coal dust settled on rooftops, damp cobblestones reflected the faint glow of gas lamps that had not yet been extinguished, and the city stretched awake with the weary rhythm of people who worked because they had no choice. Long before office clerks unlocked their doors or merchants arranged goods in their shop windows, the river was already alive. Bargemen shouted across the water as they maneuvered heavy loads through narrow passages. Dock laborers strained beneath crates that had traveled thousands of miles aboard merchant vessels from every corner of the empire. Fishermen inspected their nets with rough, weathered hands. The smell of wet timber mingled with coal smoke, horse manure, salt, stale beer, and the unmistakable odor of the river itself, a thick, earthy scent that seemed to cling to every coat and every pair of boots worn near its banks. It was a place where people learned not to ask unnecessary questions. If a crate arrived without explanation, someone unloaded it. If a boat departed after midnight, someone untied its ropes. If a stranger paid in cash and avoided conversation, another stranger accepted the money. Curiosity had little value where survival depended upon the next day's wages. Victorian London often celebrated itself as the heart of civilization, the capital of an empire upon which the sun supposedly never set. Newspapers praised technological achievements. Engineers built railways that stitched together distant towns. Electric lighting slowly began replacing gas lamps in wealthier districts. Scientific discoveries promised a future shaped by reason and progress. Grand exhibitions displayed inventions from across the globe, inviting visitors to marvel at humanity's growing mastery over nature. Yet beneath that confident narrative existed another reality. The city had grown faster than it could care for the people living inside it. Entire families occupied single rented rooms where damp walls sweated through winter months. Children worked before they could properly read. Women stitched clothing until their fingers bled for wages barely sufficient to purchase bread. Disease spread through overcrowded neighborhoods with terrifying efficiency, carried by poor sanitation and contaminated water. Tuberculosis, cholera, influenza, and countless other illnesses claimed lives that rarely appeared in official celebrations of Britain's prosperity. Death was familiar. Disappearance was familiar too. For women living at the edges of society, vanishing often produced little more than silence. Many arrived in London believing opportunity waited somewhere beyond the railway stations. They sought employment as domestic servants, factory workers, seamstresses, laundresses, cooks, or shop assistants. Some succeeded. Many did not. A single illness, an unexpected pregnancy, the loss of employment, or an abusive employer could send someone tumbling into poverty with frightening speed. Charitable organizations tried to help where they could, but resources rarely matched the scale of the need. Workhouses offered shelter under harsh conditions. Lodging houses accepted anyone who could pay a few pennies. Those unable to afford even that often found themselves sleeping beneath bridges or wandering streets until morning. Their names disappeared first. Everything else followed. If one of these women failed to return, there might be no family nearby to notice. Friends changed addresses constantly. Employers hired replacements within days. Boarding house keepers rented empty beds before sunset. Lives dissolved into London's endless movement so completely that absence itself became difficult to measure. This was the world in which the first terrible discovery emerged. It is tempting, with the benefit of modern hindsight, to imagine that investigators immediately recognized the significance of what they had found. History rarely unfolds so neatly. At first, there was confusion rather than certainty. Questions outweighed conclusions. Officers examined the remains with the limited forensic knowledge available to them, attempting to reconstruct events from evidence that had already been altered by water, time, and deliberate human intervention. The body revealed almost nothing willingly. There were no personal belongings to identify its owner. No clothing capable of tracing occupation or social class. No face that relatives might recognize. Instead, investigators confronted a puzzle assembled from absence. Medical examiners worked carefully, documenting what they could despite the limitations of 19th-century science. Every observation mattered. The approximate age of the victim. Her physical condition. The nature of the cuts. Whether injuries had occurred before or after death. These details, though incomplete, slowly began shaping an image not of who she had been, but of whoever had handled her body after life had ended. The cuts themselves became impossible to ignore. They were not identical in every location, nor did they suggest flawless precision, but they demonstrated purpose. Joints had been separated with an efficiency that implied familiarity rather than experimentation. Whoever performed the dismemberment had not acted in blind panic. This was work completed with time enough to think, to adjust, and to continue. Such observations inevitably raised uncomfortable possibilities. Did the killer possess medical training? Had they worked inside a slaughterhouse? Were they accustomed to handling knives as part of ordinary employment? Or could experience have been gained through repeated acts no one had yet connected? No answer carried certainty. Each possibility opened another corridor of speculation. Meanwhile, life in London continued almost unaffected. Newspapers certainly reported unusual crimes, but the city consumed sensational stories with remarkable speed. Public attention shifted constantly between political debates, royal affairs, industrial accidents, overseas conflicts, and the endless stream of local incidents that filled daily editions. Unless a crime offered something extraordinary, it risked fading into the background noise of urban existence. What made this discovery extraordinary was not merely its brutality. It was its silence. Most murders leave echoes. Neighbors hear arguments. Witnesses recall screams. Someone notices broken furniture, shattered windows, hurried footsteps disappearing into darkness. This crime offered none of those comforts. It seemed to have unfolded entirely beyond public view. Somewhere inside London, a woman had died. Somewhere, her body had been carefully separated. Somewhere, someone had cleaned whatever traces remained. Then, under the cover of ordinary movement, portions of that body found their way into the Thames. Every stage required privacy. Every stage required confidence. Every stage suggested planning. Investigators searched for locations capable of providing such isolation. Warehouses along the docks drew attention because they offered both space and relative seclusion after working hours. Slaughterhouses naturally entered discussions due to the availability of sharp tools and workers accustomed to cutting flesh. Medical schools, too, inspired speculation, although no evidence directly connected any institution to the crime. Private residences could not be excluded either. Victorian homes often concealed basements, outbuildings, or workshops where activities remained hidden behind locked doors. The possibilities stretched across the entire city. That breadth became one of the investigation's greatest enemies. Without knowing where death had occurred, detectives struggled to determine where to begin. Without identifying the victim, every missing persons report demanded examination. Without reliable witnesses, rumors flourished. London excelled at producing rumours. In crowded public houses, conversations grew increasingly imaginative with every retelling. Some insisted foreign criminals had introduced unfamiliar methods from continental Europe. Others whispered about secret societies operating beneath respectable institutions. A few claimed the river itself attracted evil, pointing to old legends of bodies recovered from its muddy depths over generations. Fear often seeks patterns long before evidence provides them. The police, however, could not afford imagination. They required facts. Facts arrived painfully slowly. Weeks passed. Additional searches recovered more remains believed to belong to the same woman. Each discovery answered one question while creating several more. The body could be reconstructed only partially. Critical evidence had vanished forever, either carried away by the river or intentionally concealed. The head remained missing. Portions of the upper body never appeared. With them disappeared the easiest path toward identification. Today, forensic artists might attempt facial reconstruction. DNA could be compared against national databases. Microscopic evidence invisible to Victorian investigators might transform the entire case. None of those possibilities existed. Every missing piece represented knowledge that 19th-century detectives had no means of replacing. Perhaps the most chilling realization emerged gradually rather than all at once. The murderer had almost certainly understood these limitations. Whether through formal education or practical experience, whoever disposed of the remains appeared to appreciate exactly which parts of the body could reveal identity and which methods complicated investigation. Even if such knowledge was imperfect, it exceeded what most ordinary citizens possessed. That realization quietly shifted the direction of the case. Detectives were no longer searching merely for a violent individual. They were searching for someone capable of combining violence with patience. Someone who could kill without attracting attention. Someone who could remain calm after death. Someone who could transport human remains through one of the busiest cities in the world without provoking alarm. It was a frightening profile precisely because it felt so ordinary on the surface. The killer might have looked like everyone else. A laborer ending his shift. A carter guiding his horse through crowded streets. A dock worker loading supplies before sunrise. A butcher washing his apron at the end of the day. A respectable gentleman carrying an unremarkable parcel. London was filled with people transporting heavy bundles from one place to another. Few inspired a second glance. Perhaps that was the greatest advantage of all. In a city overflowing with movement, invisibility required no disguise. It required only the confidence to appear as though one belonged. And somewhere beyond the riverbanks, beyond the fog and factory smoke, beyond the endless rows of brick houses and narrow alleys, the person responsible returned to ordinary life, unnoticed among nearly 5 million people, while the Thames carried away the evidence one tide at a time. There is a dangerous illusion that history often creates. When we look back at an unsolved crime through the comfort of more than a century of distance, it is tempting to imagine that every clue naturally pointed toward an inevitable conclusion waiting just beyond the next page. The reality was far less satisfying. For the men tasked with investigating these discoveries, there was no complete picture to study, no timeline pinned neatly across a wall, no certainty that they were even confronting the beginning of a series. They were standing inside a story they could not yet recognize, trying to understand a puzzle while most of its pieces remained scattered somewhere beyond reach. The first discovery did not announce itself as the opening chapter of one of Victorian London's most enduring mysteries. It appeared instead as an isolated horror. An exception. An incident that, with enough determination, might eventually surrender an explanation. That hope would not survive for long. As investigators revisited the evidence, uncomfortable observations continued to emerge. The body had not simply been abandoned. It had been dispersed. That distinction mattered. Dispersal required movement, and movement required opportunity. Somewhere between the place where life ended and the place where the remains surfaced, someone had traveled through London carrying a burden that would have horrified anyone who knew its true nature. Yet no one came forward with such a memory. That silence was almost as disturbing as the crime itself. London in the late 19th century was a city of constant observation without truly seeing. Thousands of eyes watched one another every day. Shopkeepers stood in their doorways. Policemen walked regular beats. Stable boys hurried through crowded streets. Market vendors called to customers from sunrise until dusk. Children played between carts and horses. Neighbors noticed arguments through thin walls. Landladies kept careful track of overdue rent. Everyone watched everyone else, and yet anonymity remained astonishingly easy. People noticed what affected their own survival. Everything else became background. A man carrying a wrapped parcel before dawn attracted little attention. A cart stopping beside the river for a few minutes was unremarkable. A laborer washing stains from his boots after work could be explained a dozen different ways. Ordinary life provided endless opportunities to hide extraordinary acts. The investigators could not ignore another unsettling possibility. Whoever had disposed of the remains may have selected locations with more thought than anyone first realized. The River Thames was not merely convenient, it was unpredictable. Tides shifted the position of floating objects. Currents carried evidence away from the place where it entered the water. Mud concealed what the river did not immediately return. Even when remains were recovered, determining precisely where they had been deposited became almost impossible. The river was not simply a dumping ground. It altered the crime itself. Every hour that passed blurred the sequence of events a little further. Water softened physical evidence. Weather erased tracks along the banks. Curious onlookers unintentionally disturbed scenes before officers could secure them. By modern standards, the investigation faced limitations that were almost unimaginable. Yet even within those limitations, experienced detectives sensed that they were dealing with someone who had planned ahead rather than reacting in panic. Planning suggested composure. Composure suggested confidence. Confidence suggested experience, or at least the belief that the risk of being caught remained low. Perhaps that confidence came from understanding the city better than the investigators themselves. Few places changed character as dramatically between day and night as Victorian London. Streets crowded with merchants and wagons during daylight could become strangely empty before sunrise. Warehouses locked their doors. Dockyards fell quiet except for the occasional watchman making his rounds. Gas lamps illuminated only fragments of the darkness, leaving long stretches where a determined individual could move unseen. The same streets that welcomed commerce by afternoon could conceal secrets before dawn. And somewhere within that vast maze of brick, smoke, warehouses, taverns, workshops, lodging houses, and narrow courts, the answers remained hidden. The public knew very little during those earliest days. Information traveled more slowly than it does today, and official details were often withheld while inquiries continued. Rumors, however, respected no such boundaries. Conversations drifted through public houses and marketplaces. People speculated about strangers, about butchers, doctors, sailors, dockworkers, and anyone whose profession involved knives or physical labor. Suspicion settled easily upon those already living at the margins of respectable society. Most of those suspicions led nowhere. That, too, became part of the tragedy. Every false lead consumed precious time. Every mistaken accusation diverted attention. Every confident theory eventually collapsed beneath the absence of proof. Meanwhile, the victim remained unnamed. There is a particular sadness that accompanies unidentified victims. A murder steals a life, but anonymity threatens to erase the person who lived it. Somewhere, this woman had once laughed at something only she found amusing. She had almost certainly worried about money, spoken with neighbors, grown tired after long days, perhaps dreamed of a different future. She was more than the circumstances of her death. Yet the investigation could not begin with those memories because no one knew who she had been. The records offered measurements. Approximate age. Physical characteristics. Clinical observations. But they could not reveal her favorite place in the city, the sound of her voice, or whether someone waited for her return without ever learning why she never came home. That absence of identity would become one of the defining shadows hanging over the entire Thames torso mystery. As months turned into years, London would witness other shocking crimes that dominated newspaper headlines and shaped public memory. Some names would become infamous across the world. Others would slowly fade into the margins of history despite leaving questions just as haunting. The Thames Torso murders would occupy that uneasy space between recognition and obscurity, known well enough to fascinate historians, yet never fully understood because the most important voice in the story had been permanently silenced. And perhaps that is why the mystery continues to endure. Not because it promises easy answers. Not because it offers the satisfaction of justice finally delivered. But because it reminds us how fragile certainty can be. A city that believed itself to be the center of modern civilization found itself confronted by a crime that slipped through every gap in its institutions. Detectives searched tirelessly, physicians examined what little evidence remained, journalists filled columns with speculation, and ordinary citizens looked over their shoulders as another rumor spread through the streets. Yet the person responsible vanished back into the crowds. No arrest followed. No confession emerged. No courtroom ever heard the full story. The Thames continued to rise and fall with the tides, carrying ships toward the sea as though nothing had happened. New buildings climbed into the skyline. Old neighborhoods changed. Generations came and went. But beneath the movement of history, one unsettling question refused to disappear. If a killer could hide so completely in the heart of Victorian London once, how many other secrets had the river carried away before anyone thought to look? That question is where our story truly begins. In the chapters that follow, we leave behind the broad silhouette of the city and move closer to the people whose lives became entwined with this mystery. Behind every discovery was a human being whose identity, circumstances, and final days deserve careful examination, not for sensation, but because understanding the victims is the only honest place from which any true crime story should proceed. In the spring of 1887, London presented itself to the world as the confident capital of an empire that stretched across continents. Newspapers celebrated economic expansion. Parliament debated the future with certainty. Steamships arrived from distant ports carrying tea, cotton, timber, spices, and people searching for opportunity. To visitors arriving by rail, the city appeared unstoppable, a monument to industry and ambition. But the closer one walked toward the eastern districts, the more that polished image began to dissolve. The elegant facades gave way to narrow streets where brick buildings leaned toward one another as though exhausted by the weight of decades. Laundry hung between windows blackened by coal smoke. Rainwater gathered in uneven cobblestones, mixing with mud left behind by horses and carts. The air carried a permanent mixture of damp timber, chimney soot, stale ale, and the salt-heavy scent drifting inland from the Thames. Every morning, before sunrise had fully broken through the grey clouds, thousands of workers were already moving through these streets with lowered heads and hurried steps, chasing employment that might last a day or disappear before noon. This was not the London that appeared on postcards. It was the London that kept the rest of the city alive. The docks never truly slept. Ships unloaded cargo through every season, regardless of cold rain or bitter wind. Men gathered outside hiring points long before dawn, hoping their names would be called for a day's labor. Some returned home with a few shillings in their pockets. Others spent the afternoon exactly where they had begun, waiting, hungry, knowing they would have to try again tomorrow. Women faced a different struggle. Employment existed, but rarely with security. Domestic service offered food and shelter in exchange for long hours and strict obedience. Factory work demanded relentless repetition under dangerous conditions. Sewing garments from cramped rented rooms paid so little that many worked deep into the night by candlelight, straining their eyesight for pennies. Laundry work left hands raw from lye and boiling water. Charitable organizations estimated that thousands of women survived week to week with no guarantee that next week's rent could be paid. A single setback could unravel everything. An illness lasting several days meant lost wages. Losing employment often meant losing accommodation. Pregnancy outside marriage could close doors that were already barely open. For those without family nearby, poverty was rarely dramatic. It was gradual. Quiet. It accumulated through unpaid bills, skipped meals, worn clothing, and impossible choices until there seemed to be no obvious path back. Many drifted from respectable employment into casual labor. Some found themselves selling flowers. Others washed dishes in taverns. Some accepted cleaning work whenever it appeared. Others disappeared into prostitution, not because it represented opportunity, but because it represented survival. Victorian society judged these women harshly while often ignoring the circumstances that had cornered them there. Their lives became increasingly invisible. Ironically, so did their disappearances. Police records from the period reveal a city where people frequently went missing for reasons both ordinary and tragic. Workers relocated without informing employers. Servants left one household for another. Couples fled debts. Children were sent to relatives. Migrants arrived without documentation and vanished into overcrowded neighborhoods. In many cases, no centralized system existed to connect one disappearance with another. Unless someone actively searched, an absent person could simply dissolve into London's enormous population. This reality would haunt every stage of the Thames Torso investigation. When detectives attempted to identify the first recovered victim, they faced an overwhelming question. Where should they even begin? Thousands of women matched broad physical descriptions. Many had no surviving photographs. Medical records were inconsistent or non-existent. Even clothing, one of the most useful identifiers of the period, offered little help because so much had been removed. The victim remained silent. The city remained enormous. And somewhere within it, ordinary life continued without interruption. Morning markets filled with customers bargaining over vegetables and fish. School children hurried through puddles carrying books beneath their coats. Omnibuses rattled across busy intersections while newspaper boys shouted the latest headlines from street corners. Respectable families discussed politics over breakfast. Factory whistles signaled the beginning of another workday. To most Londoners, the unsettling discovery near the Thames belonged to someone else's world. Until another discovery arrived. Then another. Only later would historians connect these moments into what is now remembered as the Thames Torso murders. At the time, investigators could not know they were standing at the edge of a pattern. They were still attempting to understand one victim before circumstances forced them to consider the possibility of more. The geography of London itself complicated every effort. The River Thames curved through the city like a living artery, connecting wealthy government districts with crowded industrial neighborhoods and isolated marshlands farther east. Warehouses lined its banks. Shipyards rose beside public wharves. Small ferries crossed constantly, carrying workers from one side to the other. Hundreds of barges drifted along predictable commercial routes, transporting coal, timber, grain, and manufactured goods. To an outsider, the river appeared chaotic. To those who worked upon it every day, it possessed a rhythm. The tides governed everything. Experienced bargemen understood where floating debris tended to gather, where currents accelerated, where objects became trapped beneath piers or lodged among reeds along quieter stretches of shoreline. They planned journeys around water levels that changed twice each day. Their knowledge came not from books but from years spent reading subtle movements that escaped ordinary observers. If someone wished to dispose of evidence in the Thames, familiarity with those rhythms could become an extraordinary advantage. That possibility lingered quietly in investigators' minds, though no evidence yet pointed toward any particular profession or individual. The river itself had long occupied a peculiar place in London's imagination. It symbolized prosperity and commerce, yet it also represented uncertainty. Stories circulated for generations about unexpected discoveries emerging from its waters. Lost valuables occasionally resurfaced. So did the victims of accidents, drownings, and suicides. Police assigned to river patrols accepted such recoveries as an unfortunate part of their work. But this felt different. There was intention here. The distinction mattered because intentional acts reveal choices. Every choice narrows possibilities. Someone had selected the victim. Someone had chosen where death would occur. Someone had decided how to conceal the crime. Someone had transported the remains. Someone had relied upon the Thames to complete the final stage. Each decision implied preparation. Preparation implied opportunity. Opportunity implied a life capable of hiding extraordinary actions within ordinary routines. Meanwhile, the neighborhood surrounding the river continued breathing with remarkable resilience. Children invented games among stacks of shipping crates. Women queued outside bakeries before dawn, hoping discounted loaves remained available. Public houses filled each evening with laborers whose conversations revolved around wages, weather, politics, and rumors drifting through the docks. Music spilled into narrow streets from crowded taverns while church bells echoed above rooftops every Sunday morning. Weddings, funerals, births, illnesses, celebrations, and heartbreak unfolded in cramped homes whose occupants knew little about the mystery beginning to emerge beyond occasional newspaper reports. History often remembers cities through their greatest tragedies. The people living inside them usually remember something much smaller. A familiar face missing from the neighborhood. An empty chair at dinner. A room whose rent had suddenly gone unpaid. A mother waiting longer than usual for her daughter to return. A friend wondering why no letter ever arrived. The victims of the Thames torso murders almost certainly belonged to this quieter world. They were not public figures whose disappearances dominated headlines from the beginning. They lived among London's working poor, where survival demanded constant movement and where absence could too easily be mistaken for another difficult turn in an already difficult life. That social reality may have become one of the killer's greatest protections. Choosing victims from society's margins did not make the crimes less shocking. It made them harder to untangle. Because before detectives could identify a murderer, they first had to reconstruct lives that official records had barely preserved. And in Victorian London, where thousands struggled simply to endure each passing week, reconstructing an ordinary life could prove almost as difficult as solving the murder itself. By the late 1880s, London had become a city of astonishing contrasts. A gentleman could leave a lavish dinner in the West End, step into a horse-drawn carriage, and within less than an hour find himself passing streets where entire families survived on little more than bread, weak tea, and whatever work they could secure before nightfall. Wealth and poverty did not merely coexist, they shared the same skyline. Towering church spires overlooked overcrowded lodging houses. Government buildings stood only a few miles from districts where children scavenged for coal that had fallen from wagons. The empire projected power across oceans, yet many of its own citizens lived one missed meal away from desperation. Few places reflected this divide more clearly than the neighborhoods stretching east toward the docks. The East End was not one single community but a patchwork of occupations, languages, and lives woven together by necessity. Irish labourers worked beside English dockhands. Jewish immigrants who had fled persecution established small workshops and businesses. Sailors from Scandinavia, Germany, India, China, and countless other ports could be seen walking the riverside after their ships arrived. Every accent carried its own story. Every face hinted at a different journey. The streets echoed with conversations from across Europe and beyond, yet nearly everyone shared one thing in common. Work determined survival. If the docks were busy, money flowed. If ships were delayed, entire neighborhoods felt the consequences. Employment often began before sunrise. Men gathered outside hiring gates in heavy boots still damp from yesterday's rain. Foremen walked slowly along the waiting crowd, selecting workers almost as casually as merchants choosing livestock at market. Those fortunate enough to be picked hurried toward the waterfront without complaint. Those left behind lingered in silence, pretending not to notice the disappointment written across one another's faces. No contract guaranteed tomorrow. Every morning began the same uncertain way. Women faced an equally unforgiving reality, though their struggles unfolded largely behind closed doors. In cramped rented rooms illuminated by weak daylight filtering through soot-covered windows, seamstresses bent over fabric for hours without lifting their heads. The repetitive movement left shoulders stiff and eyesight fading long before old age. Washerwomen hauled buckets of water up narrow staircases, scrubbed clothing until their knuckles split open, and returned garments that would be dirty again within days. Domestic servants often disappeared into wealthy households before dawn and emerged only after darkness had settled over the city once more. The work was exhausting. The pay was barely enough. Still, losing such employment could be catastrophic. A servant dismissed without notice frequently lost both wages and accommodation on the same day. Factory owners replaced absent workers with little hesitation. Boarding houses demanded payment regardless of illness or personal tragedy. There were few safety nets waiting beneath those who stumbled. Many simply kept falling. Some sought temporary shelter in charitable institutions. Others relied upon churches distributing food during particularly harsh winters. Some borrowed money they could never realistically repay. Others entered relationships not out of affection but because companionship occasionally offered protection against hunger. It was within these fragile lives that vulnerability quietly took root. The women later connected to the Thames torso murders were believed to have come from this world. They were not members of influential families whose absence would trigger immediate investigations across the city. They belonged to London's enormous working population, where names disappeared from public memory with unsettling ease. One of the most heartbreaking realities confronting investigators was not merely the brutality of the crimes but the realization that several victims might never be identified at all. Without modern records, identification depended upon recognition. Someone needed to remember a face. Someone needed to recognize clothing. Someone needed to report a disappearance. When those pieces failed to align, the dead remained strangers. The consequences reached far beyond the investigation itself. Imagine a sister who assumed her sibling had found work elsewhere. A landlord who rented the empty room to another tenant after only a few days. An employer who believed a maid had accepted a better position. A friend who expected a letter that never arrived. Each individual explanation seemed reasonable on its own. Together, they created silence. Silence became one of the killer's greatest allies. The Metropolitan Police understood these social realities better than many historians sometimes acknowledge. Detectives working the East End knew that poverty complicated every investigation. Witnesses moved frequently. Addresses changed. Nicknames often replaced legal names. Some residents distrusted authorities because previous encounters had brought little comfort. Others feared that speaking openly might jeopardize employment or attract unwanted attention from criminals living in the same neighborhoods. Information rarely traveled in straight lines. Instead, it emerged through conversations in taverns, whispers exchanged between neighbors, remarks overheard at markets, or observations made by people who considered themselves too insignificant to matter. A single forgotten detail could change an entire investigation. Unfortunately, details were difficult to separate from speculation. Victorian London thrived on rumor. Every sensational crime produced an endless stream of theories. Newspapers competed fiercely for readers, and dramatic headlines sold copies. Reporters gathered information wherever they could find it, often relying upon unnamed sources, unofficial conversations, and public imagination when confirmed facts remained scarce. Some articles reflected careful reporting. Others blurred the line between evidence and assumption. As stories spread, fear transformed ordinary behavior into apparent clues. A quiet neighbor suddenly seemed suspicious. A butcher working late attracted unnecessary attention. A doctor returning home after midnight became the subject of whispered conversations. Foreigners, already viewed with suspicion by parts of society, frequently found themselves accused without evidence simply because they appeared unfamiliar. These reactions revealed as much about Victorian anxieties as they did about the crimes themselves. The investigation unfolded against this backdrop of uncertainty, where every new theory threatened to overshadow the limited facts available. Meanwhile, the river continued shaping daily life. To understand the Thames during this period is to understand why it became such a central element of the mystery. It was more than a geographical feature. It functioned as London's commercial highway. Hundreds of vessels moved continuously along its surface. Coal barges drifted downstream. Tugboats pulled heavier cargo through difficult currents. Ferries transported workers between opposite banks. Small fishing boats navigated quieter sections where industrial traffic briefly thinned. No one could monitor every movement. Even the river police, experienced though they were, faced impossible odds. Their patrols covered vast stretches of water where changing tides constantly altered conditions. Objects submerged at high tide might appear hours later several miles away. Floating debris collected beneath bridges before dispersing again with shifting currents. Determining precisely when or where something had entered the river often proved impossible. For investigators, this uncertainty created a nightmare. Each recovered body part represented both evidence and lost opportunity. Every hour spent drifting through the water removed traces that might otherwise have revealed crucial answers. Blood disappeared. Fibers washed away. Footprints never existed. Scents vanished. The river cleaned the scene long before detectives arrived. Even so, experienced medical examiners continued studying the remains with remarkable diligence for their time. They measured bones, examined muscle tissue, estimated age, noted physical characteristics, and searched for any distinctive feature capable of identifying the victim. Their conclusions remained cautious because caution was essential. Scientific certainty was limited. Overconfidence could mislead an entire investigation. Yet one observation returned repeatedly. The dismemberment did not appear random. There was purpose in the way the body had been separated. Whether that purpose reflected professional training or practical familiarity remained impossible to prove, but the consistency was difficult to ignore. This subtle distinction shaped how detectives began viewing the unknown offender. Rather than imagining someone overwhelmed by uncontrollable rage, they increasingly considered the possibility of an individual capable of extraordinary self-control after the killing had already taken place. That image was deeply unsettling. Violence committed in sudden anger often leaves disorder behind. Violence followed by deliberate concealment suggests something altogether different. It suggests patience, planning, the ability to continue making calculated decisions long after another person's life has ended. Somewhere within London's endless streets, that individual almost certainly resumed an ordinary routine. Perhaps neighbors exchanged polite greetings without suspicion. Perhaps co-workers shared lunch breaks or evening drinks. Perhaps family members noticed nothing unusual at all. History rarely announces the presence of those who will later become infamous. Most often, they blend quietly into the crowd until hindsight teaches the world where to look. But in the spring of 1887, hindsight did not yet exist. There was only a growing sense that something profoundly disturbing had entered the life of the city, a mystery carried by the Thames itself, moving silently beneath bridges, past warehouses and wharves, through the very heart of the British Empire. While no one yet realized that this was only the beginning. As the months passed, the first discovery refused to settle into the neat category of an isolated crime. Detectives continued to search for a name, a family, a witness, or a forgotten report that might connect the unidentified woman to the life she had once lived. Every inquiry began with cautious optimism and ended with another unanswered question. The files grew thicker, but certainty remained painfully thin. The greatest obstacle was not a lack of effort. It was the nature of Victorian London itself. Nearly 5 million people lived within the sprawling metropolis by the late 19th century. Every day, thousands arrived by train or ship while thousands more departed in search of work elsewhere. Boarding houses filled and emptied with astonishing speed. Laborious followed seasonal employment. Domestic servants changed households without leaving formal records. A woman could leave one neighborhood on Monday, begin working in another by Wednesday, and disappear completely by the following week without anyone outside her immediate circle realizing she was gone. The city was always moving. That movement created opportunity. It also created perfect conditions for people to vanish. Modern investigators often rely on a network of documentation that Victorian detectives simply did not possess. Birth certificates, employment databases, financial transactions, surveillance cameras, mobile phones, digital records, none of these existed. Instead, an investigation depended upon conversations, handwritten notes, local knowledge, and memory. Memory, however, is fragile. Witnesses confuse dates. Neighbors misremember faces. Time reshapes certainty into assumption. Every passing week made the task more difficult. The Metropolitan Police worked methodically within the limits of their era. Officers circulated descriptions based on the medical examination. They compared reports of missing women. They questioned lodging housekeepers who might remember tenants failing to return. They visited workhouses, hospitals, charitable missions, and parish officials, hoping someone might recognize the limited details available. Most conversations ended with polite apologies. Some produced promising leads that collapsed almost immediately. Others generated nothing at all. The unknown woman remained exactly that. Unknown. And yet, despite the absence of a name, the investigation uncovered something else that would prove equally significant. The victim almost certainly belonged to London's working poor. That conclusion emerged not because of a single decisive clue, but because of everything surrounding the case. Wealthy women rarely disappeared without immediate notice. Middle-class families maintained social networks, employers, neighbors, relatives, and acquaintances who would ask questions. Newspapers frequently reported unexplained absences involving respectable households. For women living in poverty, life unfolded differently. Many rented beds rather than rooms. Some paid nightly instead of weekly. Employment came and went. Friendships formed quickly and dissolved just as easily as people searched for work elsewhere. The harsh reality was impossible to ignore. A woman surviving at society's margins could disappear into London's vastness with frightening ease. Whether the killer deliberately understood this vulnerability cannot be proven. But history suggests that those most isolated often faced the greatest danger. While investigators searched for answers, another force quietly shaped public perception. The newspapers. Victorian journalism existed in fierce competition. Cheap daily publications reached enormous audiences eager for stories that combined mystery, violence, and suspense. Editors understood that sensational crime sold papers, and reporters worked tirelessly to uncover exclusive details before rival publications could do the same. Some accounts remained restrained. Others leaned heavily into speculation. Descriptions grew more dramatic with each retelling. Anonymous sources claimed inside knowledge. Unverified theories circulated alongside confirmed facts. Readers debated possible suspects in public houses, barbershops, factory lunchrooms, and railway platforms. The city became an echo chamber of uncertainty. One person insisted the murderer possessed medical training. Another argued only a butcher could have displayed such confidence with a knife. Someone else believed the crime pointed toward sailors familiar with transporting cargo unnoticed. Others imagined elaborate conspiracies involving secret organizations operating beneath respectable society. Very little of it rested upon evidence. Fear has always possessed an extraordinary ability to transform coincidence into conviction. Yet behind the growing speculation stood investigators who remained painfully aware of how little they actually knew. They did not know where the victim had spent her final evening. They did not know who had last seen her alive. They did not know the location of the murder. They did not know how the remains had been transported. Most importantly, they did not know whether this crime would ever happen again. That final uncertainty lingered over every discussion. If the murder truly represented a single terrible act, time might eventually reveal the person responsible through an overlooked witness or an unexpected confession. But if it represented something else? If another victim appeared? The entire meaning of the investigation would change. No detective wanted to voice that possibility too confidently. Not yet. There simply was not enough evidence. Life continued to unfold across London with remarkable indifference to those private fears. Steam locomotives arrived at crowded stations carrying businessmen and labourers alike. Church bells marked the passing weeks. Children raced through alleyways chasing homemade toys. Couples married, families mourned ordinary losses, merchants negotiated prices along bustling markets, and evening crowds packed music halls seeking laughter after exhausting days of work. History often compresses years into a handful of dramatic moments. Reality is slower. Most people living through 1887 never imagined they occupied the opening pages of a mystery that historians would still debate more than a century later. To them, the city simply carried on. The Thames rose and fell with each tide. Cargo continued moving beneath London's bridges. Factories filled the air with smoke that settled over rooftops before dawn. The rhythms of ordinary existence refused to pause. Somewhere within those familiar routines, however, an unknown individual also continued living an apparently ordinary life. Perhaps he worked regular hours. Perhaps he greeted neighbors each morning. Perhaps he blended so naturally into the landscape of Victorian London that no one would ever remember seeing him. That possibility remains one of the most unsettling aspects of the Thames Torso murders. Not the brutality alone. Not the mystery alone. But the realization that extraordinary violence can exist alongside remarkable normality. The unknown offender did not leave behind theatrical messages or public declarations. There were no taunting letters accepted as authentic by investigators. No dramatic attempts to claim responsibility. Instead, the crime seemed almost designed to disappear into the city's enormous machinery, hidden among its warehouses, crowded docks, rented rooms, and anonymous streets. In many ways, London itself became an unwilling accomplice. Its size concealed movement. Its poverty concealed absence. Its river concealed evidence. Its endless population concealed identity. Every characteristic that made the imperial capital powerful also made it extraordinarily difficult to police. Years later, another series of murders would dominate headlines across Britain and eventually overshadow nearly every other crime of the Victorian era. Public memory would become inseparable from one infamous name, while the earlier discoveries along the Thames gradually slipped into the background of history. Yet for the detectives who stood beside the river in 1887, none of that future was visible. They knew only that they had recovered the remains of an unidentified young woman. They knew someone had gone to considerable effort to prevent her from being recognized. And they knew that somewhere beyond the fog-covered docks, beyond the crowded lodging houses and smoke-filled streets, the person responsible had disappeared back into the city without leaving a single answer behind. What they could not know was that the silence surrounding this first victim would not remain unique for long. Before long, London would be forced to confront another discovery. Then another. And with each new case, the pattern would become harder to dismiss, the questions more unsettling, and the hope of identifying every victim increasingly remote. The story that began with a single anonymous bundle drifting through the Thames was quietly expanding into one of the darkest unsolved mysteries of the Victorian age, a mystery built not only upon the identity of a killer, but upon the forgotten lives of women whose stories had almost been erased before anyone realized they were connected. One of the greatest tragedies surrounding the Thames Torso murders is that history remembers the mystery more clearly than it remembers the women. Most true crime stories begin with a name. A photograph. A family portrait. A birthday. A favorite place. Someone who can say, this is who they were before everything changed. The Thames Torso murders deny us that beginning. 3 of the 4 principal victims have never been conclusively identified. Their names, their families, their hopes, and even the ordinary details of their daily lives, have been swallowed by time almost as completely as the river concealed the evidence. The official records describe measurements, estimated ages, and medical observations. They do not tell us who these women laughed with, what kind of work exhausted their hands, or whether someone waited anxiously for them to return home. That silence is part of the crime. When a person's identity is lost, it becomes easier for history to remember only the violence that followed. Yet these women lived lives before they became evidence. Victorian London was filled with women whose existence rarely entered official records. Domestic servants moved from one household to another with little documentation. Factory workers labored anonymously among hundreds of others. Seamstresses stitched garments that would be worn by strangers they would never meet. Laundry workers spent long days over steaming tubs, while street vendors sold flowers, matches, or fruit simply to earn enough for another night's lodging. Many came to London believing opportunity waited there. Some had travelled from rural England after hearing stories of plentiful work in the capital. Others arrived from Ireland after years of hardship. Some followed relatives already living in the city, while others came alone, carrying little more than a small case of clothing and the hope that determination would be enough. For many, that hope was tested almost immediately. Employment could disappear overnight. Rent was due every week. Food prices rose and fell. Illness meant lost income. There were few protections against bad luck. A woman who lost her position as a servant often lost her room as well. A factory accident could leave someone unable to work for weeks. A pregnancy outside marriage could dramatically reduce employment opportunities. Every setback narrowed the choices available. This social reality matters because it shaped the lives of the victims long before investigators ever encountered them. Historians believe the killer likely selected women whose disappearances would not immediately trigger a large-scale search. That conclusion is based not on certainty about the offender's motives, but on the pattern that emerged. The known victims appear to have come from economically vulnerable backgrounds where frequent moves, insecure employment, and limited family support made unexplained absences tragically easier to overlook. Among the principal cases linked to the Thames Torso murders, only one victim has been identified with confidence. Her name was Elizabeth Jackson. Unlike the others, fragments of documentary evidence allow historians to glimpse portions of her life. Those records do not transform her into a fully known person, but they do remind us that behind the forensic descriptions stood a real woman navigating the difficult realities of Victorian London. Elizabeth was about 24 years old. She was poor. She was pregnant. Like countless other women in the East End, she lived in circumstances shaped by uncertainty. Steady employment was difficult to maintain, housing was often temporary, and financial hardship touched nearly every aspect of daily life. The surviving historical record does not provide a complete biography. There are significant gaps, and responsible historical accounts acknowledge those limits rather than filling them with speculation. What can be said with confidence is that Elizabeth's life reflected the vulnerability experienced by many women in late 19th century London. When investigators eventually identified her, the discovery accomplished something profoundly important. It restored a name. Instead of referring only to measurements and medical observations, officials could finally speak of a person. Someone who had existed before becoming a victim. Someone whose disappearance affected real people. That distinction may seem small, but in an investigation dominated by anonymity, it carried enormous weight. For the remaining unidentified women, history cannot offer the same certainty. The victim recovered during the Raynham case is believed to have been between 27 and 29 years old based on the medical assessment available at the time. Beyond that, almost everything remains uncertain. No confirmed identity has ever been established. The same is true for the woman whose remains were discovered during the Whitehall mystery and for the victim in the Pinchin Street case. Their anonymity continues to shape the investigation more than a century later. Modern forensic science has solved cases once thought impossible through DNA analysis, genetic genealogy, and digital record comparisons. Unfortunately, the Thames Torso murders present extraordinary challenges. The passage of time, incomplete preservation of evidence, and the limited investigative methods available in the 1880s mean that many opportunities available to modern investigators simply no longer exist. As a result, the women remain known primarily by the locations where their remains were discovered rather than by the names they carried throughout their lives. That fact alone speaks volumes about how completely the killer succeeded in frustrating identification. Yet history should resist allowing that anonymity to become their defining characteristic. Each victim occupied a place within London's immense social fabric. Each had routines, acquaintances, and experiences that unfolded against the backdrop of one of the world's fastest-growing cities. They crossed crowded streets, waited in bread lines, searched for work, exchanged conversations with neighbors, and navigated the same difficult choices faced by thousands of working-class women every day. Those ordinary moments deserve remembrance alongside the investigation itself. Because before these women became part of an enduring historical mystery, they were simply people trying to build lives in a city that often offered little security and even less mercy. The women who disappeared into the Thames Torso mystery were living in a city that demanded resilience every single day. Survival was rarely determined by one dramatic event. More often, it was decided by countless ordinary moments: a day's wages earned or lost, a landlord willing to wait another week for rent, a neighbor sharing a loaf of bread, an employer deciding whether to keep or dismiss a servant. For many working-class women in Victorian London, life followed routines that were physically exhausting and emotionally uncertain. Before sunrise, they might already be walking through damp streets toward a laundry, a factory, or a private household where a full day's work awaited. Domestic servants cleaned fireplaces, scrubbed floors, prepared meals, emptied chamber pots, polished silver, and climbed endless flights of stairs carrying heavy buckets of water. Seamstresses spent hours bent over needle and thread until fading light forced them to continue by candle. Factory workers repeated the same movements hundreds of times a day amid noise, dust, and machinery that offered little protection from injury. When work ended, another challenge began: finding somewhere to sleep. Some women rented only a bed rather than an entire room. In the poorest lodging houses, several unrelated people might sleep in the same cramped space, separated by little more than a curtain or a few feet of floor. Privacy scarcely existed. Belongings had to be carried or carefully hidden because theft was common. Those unable to pay even a modest nightly fee sometimes walked the streets until morning or sought temporary shelter through churches and charitable organizations. Within this environment, friendships often formed quickly. Neighbors looked after one another's children. Women shared news of employers looking for help. Someone might recommend a boarding house with lower rent or warn others about a dangerous street after dark. These informal networks became essential because official support was limited. They created small communities inside an enormous city, communities held together by trust more than by permanence. Yet these same communities were fragile. People came and went constantly. A woman leaving to seek work in another district might never return, and those who knew her could reasonably assume she had simply found a better opportunity elsewhere. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Eventually, memory softened into uncertainty. Did she leave voluntarily? Did she write and the letter never arrive? Did someone mention seeing her near the docks? No one could be completely sure. This uncertainty helps explain why identifying victims proved so extraordinarily difficult. Historians caution against assuming that every disappearance reflected violence. Victorian London was a place of remarkable mobility, and many people genuinely did begin new lives elsewhere. That reality forced investigators to separate ordinary disappearances from the far rarer possibility of homicide, a task made even harder when the victim could not immediately be identified. Among the principal cases connected to the Thames Torso murders, Elizabeth Jackson stands apart because her identity eventually became known. Her case provides historians with a rare opportunity to move beyond anonymous forensic descriptions and glimpse the human cost of the crimes. The surviving records concerning Elizabeth are incomplete, but they establish several important facts. She was a young woman, approximately 24 years old. She was living in poverty. She was pregnant at the time of her death. Those facts alone speak to the difficult circumstances many women faced during this period, though they do not tell the whole story of who she was. It is important not to mistake limited records for a complete life. Historical documents preserve only fragments. An address. A date. An official statement. A brief mention in an inquiry. Between those surviving pieces existed countless moments that were never recorded because no one imagined history would one day search for them. We do not know every conversation Elizabeth had with friends. We do not know every hope she carried into adulthood or every disappointment she endured. Like so many ordinary people of the 19th century, most of her life passed without written documentation. That absence invites restraint rather than invention. Responsible history acknowledges what cannot be known. Even so, the available evidence reminds us that Elizabeth was more than a victim. She was a member of London's working poor, navigating circumstances shared by thousands of others. Her struggles were not unusual for the era. What happened to her afterward was. The unidentified victims deserve the same recognition, even if history cannot restore their names. The woman connected to the Raynham discovery was estimated to be in her late 20s. The victim found during the Whitehall case has never been conclusively identified. The woman whose remains were recovered in the Pinchin Street investigation likewise remains unknown. Modern researchers continue to examine archival material, missing person reports, and contemporary newspaper accounts, but no universally accepted identification has emerged. Their anonymity has shaped how the public remembers the case. People often refer to them by the places where their remains were discovered rather than by personal identities. Raynham, Whitehall, Pinchin Street. Locations replaced names. That transformation reflects one of the saddest consequences of unsolved crime. When justice remains elusive, geography sometimes survives more clearly than biography. Looking back today, it is easy to focus exclusively on the mystery, the unanswered questions, the theories about the offender, the investigative failures imposed by the limitations of the era. Yet doing so risks overlooking the people whose lives gave rise to those questions in the first place. Every unidentified victim belonged somewhere before becoming part of history. Someone may have remembered their smile. Someone may have wondered why they never returned. Someone may have spent years hoping for an explanation that never came. Those quiet acts of waiting rarely appear in official records, but they form an equally important part of the story. As the investigation slowly unfolded, detectives continued searching for identities because they understood a fundamental truth that remains central to criminal investigations today. Discovering who the victim was is often the first step toward understanding why the crime occurred and who might be responsible. In the Thames Torso murders, that first step proved heartbreakingly difficult. Without names, investigators were forced to reconstruct lives from almost nothing. Without complete lives, motives remained uncertain. And without certainty, the mystery only deepened. It was against this backdrop of unanswered questions that London would soon face another grim discovery, one that suggested the first unidentified woman might not be an isolated tragedy, but part of a pattern that investigators could no longer afford to ignore. The emergence of a pattern changed the way London looked at these victims. Before connections were suspected, each discovery existed as its own tragedy. A woman whose identity could not be established. Remains recovered from the river. A difficult investigation with more questions than answers. But once similarities began to appear, the victims were no longer isolated figures separated by circumstance. They became part of a larger story, one that forced investigators and the public to confront the possibility that multiple women had suffered at the hands of the same unknown individual. Yet even as the investigation expanded, the women themselves remained at risk of becoming secondary characters in their own stories. This is one of the enduring challenges of historical crime. The person responsible often becomes the subject of endless speculation, while the victims are reduced to a few lines in an old newspaper archive. Their final moments become documented. Their earlier years disappear. The women connected to the Thames Torso murders deserve to be remembered differently. They lived in a world where many people were known only within small circles. A neighbor might know someone's kindness. A coworker might know their sense of humor. A family member might remember childhood memories that no official document ever recorded. When those private connections disappeared, history was left with only fragments. The absence of information does not mean the absence of a life. A woman without a surviving photograph was still someone who looked forward to certain mornings. A woman without letters was still someone who had conversations. A woman without a documented career still worked, struggled, adapted, and endured. Victorian society often measured people according to status, wealth, and respectability. Those with property, titles, or influence left behind extensive records. Their marriages, business dealings, illnesses, and deaths were carefully documented. The poor frequently left behind far fewer traces, not because their lives mattered less, but because the systems recording history were never designed equally for everyone. This imbalance continues to influence how these cases are understood today. The unidentified women of the Thames Torso murders are sometimes described only through the circumstances of their deaths. They become the Rainham victim or the Whitehall victim, labels connected to discovery sites rather than personal identity. Those descriptions are useful for historians, but they can never represent the entirety of who these women were. A location is not a person. A crime scene is not a life. The places where they were found tell us how their stories ended. They tell us almost nothing about how their stories began. The woman later identified as Elizabeth Jackson provides the clearest reminder of this distinction. Her name survived when others did not, allowing history to see at least a small portion of the person behind the investigation. Elizabeth was not simply evidence. She was a young woman living through a difficult period of enormous social change. Like many others, she existed within the uncertain space between hope and hardship. London offered possibilities, but it also exposed vulnerable people to dangers that wealthier citizens could often avoid. Her pregnancy adds another layer of historical context. For women without financial security or strong family support, pregnancy could dramatically alter their circumstances. Employment opportunities narrowed. Social judgment intensified. Housing became more difficult to maintain. Support systems were often limited. The records cannot tell us exactly what Elizabeth felt or what decisions she considered in the days before her death. Any attempt to describe her private thoughts would be speculation. But the broader reality of the period is clear. Women in her position often carried burdens that were largely invisible to society. They were expected to survive without being given many resources to do so. That vulnerability is essential to understanding the Thames Torso murders. The victims were not simply chosen because of where they lived or how society viewed them. They were human beings living within conditions that made them less visible when something went wrong. Their circumstances created gaps in records, gaps in communication, gaps in accountability. Those gaps became painfully significant after their deaths. A missing person investigation begins with someone asking a question. Where is she? But if no one knows she is missing, that question may never be asked. For some of these victims, the search may have begun too late or perhaps never begun at all. There may have been people who noticed their absence but had no reason to connect it with danger. A woman leaving a lodging house was not unusual. A worker failing to appear at a job was not always reported. Someone moving from one district to another was part of everyday London life. The city was full of departures. Not every departure raised an alarm. This reality created a painful contrast. London was one of the most heavily populated cities on Earth, yet individual lives could become remarkably difficult to trace. The same crowded streets that provided companionship and opportunity could also provide anonymity. For investigators, the problem became increasingly clear. Finding the offender required understanding the victims. Understanding the victims required knowing who they were. And knowing who they were proved to be the greatest challenge of all. As the years passed, historians and researchers would continue returning to the surviving evidence. They would examine newspaper reports, police documents, medical notes, and social records, searching for overlooked details that might restore pieces of these women's identities. Some questions may never be answered. What were their dreams? Who were the people they loved? What places did they call home? What ordinary moments filled the final chapters of their lives? Those questions remain open because history preserved the crime more completely than it preserved the people. But remembering them requires asking those questions anyway. The story of the Thames Torso murders is not only a story about an unknown offender moving through Victorian London. It is also a story about the women whose lives intersected with that mystery, women who existed beyond the boundaries of official records and beyond the labels later attached to them. They were daughters, sisters, friends, workers, and neighbors. They were people who belonged to a city that often overlooked them while they were alive and struggled to remember them after death. More than a century later, the unanswered mystery surrounding their deaths remains powerful. But the most important unanswered question is not only who was responsible. It is also this: who were these women before the world knew how they died? Because every investigation begins with evidence. But every victim begins with a life. The year was 1887, and London had no idea that a mystery was beginning to form beneath the surface of everyday life. At first, there was no single name attached to the fear. No symbol. No clear pattern. There was only a discovery, a collection of questions, and the uncomfortable realization that somewhere within the enormous machinery of the city, something terrible had happened. The first known case connected to the Thames Torso murders would later become known as the Rainham Mystery. It began near the river. The Thames was a place of constant movement, carrying the energy of the city from one district to another. Barges traveled along its currents carrying coal, timber, and goods from distant ports. Workers moved along the riverbanks with familiar routines, their days shaped by tides, weather, and the demands of commerce. The river was both a workplace and a lifeline. But on that day in May 1887, the Thames revealed something that belonged not to commerce, but to tragedy. A man working on the river noticed a package floating in the water near Rainham. At first glance, it appeared to be discarded material, the kind of object that regularly drifted along London's waterways. The river collected everything the city abandoned. Broken tools, damaged cargo, pieces of wood, and countless other remnants of daily life often surfaced along the banks. There was no reason to believe this discovery would be different. Until it was opened. Inside was the torso of a woman. The discovery immediately transformed a quiet riverside location into the center of a disturbing investigation. The authorities were called. The remains were examined. The questions began. Who was she? Where had she died? Who had placed her in the river? And perhaps most importantly, how long had someone known that she was missing? The first challenge was identifying the victim. Without a head, investigators lost one of the most immediate ways families might recognize a missing person. Without personal belongings, there were few clues connecting the remains to a specific individual. The body itself could provide only limited information. Medical examination suggested that the victim was a young woman, likely in her late 20s. Beyond that, much remained uncertain. She had no name. She had no confirmed history. She had no known family searching for her. She existed in the investigation first as a victim, not as a person. This was one of the most painful realities of the case. Before investigators could understand what had happened, they had to discover who had suffered. But Victorian London was a difficult place in which to search for someone who had vanished. The city contained countless women living uncertain lives. Many worked in temporary positions. Many moved frequently between addresses. Many had little contact with official institutions. Some lived alone. Others shared crowded accommodations where people came and went constantly. A disappearance could easily become lost among thousands of other changes. Someone leaving a rented room might have found new employment elsewhere. Someone failing to appear at work might have been dismissed and replaced. Someone who stopped writing letters might have simply been assumed to have moved on. For investigators, every possible lead had to be considered carefully. A missing woman from another district. A person reported absent by a worried acquaintance. A worker who never returned after leaving for the evening. Each possibility had to be examined. But the search quickly revealed another troubling aspect of the crime. The condition of the remains suggested that this was not an accidental death. The woman had not simply fallen victim to circumstances. Someone had deliberately concealed her identity and attempted to prevent investigators from understanding what had occurred. The methods involved raised difficult questions about the person responsible. The dismemberment showed a level of familiarity with the human body that immediately attracted attention. Investigators and medical professionals considered several possibilities. Perhaps the offender had experience with anatomy. Perhaps they worked in an occupation involving cutting tools. Perhaps their knowledge came from another source entirely. There was no definitive answer. But the implication was unsettling. The crime appeared to involve preparation. Preparation required time. Time required opportunity. And opportunity suggested that the person responsible may have lived an ordinary life while carrying out an extraordinary act. That possibility disturbed investigators because it challenged the idea that danger always announced itself. In reality, the person responsible did not need to appear unusual. They did not need to attract attention. They only needed to move through London unnoticed. And London was a city where being unnoticed was remarkably easy. As detectives attempted to reconstruct the timeline, they faced another major obstacle. The location where the remains were discovered was almost certainly not the place where the woman had died. The river had separated the evidence from its origin. The Thames carried objects away from where they entered the water. Currents shifted. Tides changed. Hours and miles could separate an event from its discovery. The river preserved some things while destroying others. It was a perfect environment for uncertainty. Every answer seemed to create another question. If the woman had not died near Raynham, where had she been killed? How had the remains reached the river? How long had they traveled before being discovered? Had anyone seen something unusual? Had anyone heard anything? The investigation expanded outward, but the city offered few immediate answers. Meanwhile, the public remained largely unaware of how significant the case might become. London had experienced many crimes. Some shocked the public for a few days before being replaced by another headline. Others remained unresolved and slowly disappeared from public conversation. At this moment, no one knew whether the Raynham discovery represented a single horrific act or the beginning of something larger. There was no way to know that similar questions would soon emerge again. No way to know that investigators would eventually find themselves examining multiple cases with disturbing similarities. No way to know that the Thames, the same river that powered the city's growth and connected its communities, would become linked forever with one of Victorian London's darkest mysteries. For now, there was only one victim. An unidentified woman. A body recovered from the river. And a growing realization among investigators that somewhere in London, someone had committed a crime that required more than violence. It required secrecy. It required confidence. And it required a city large enough to hide almost anything. The discovery at Raynham did not immediately reveal the full scale of what had happened. Investigators were forced to work backward, attempting to rebuild a story from fragments rather than following a clear path from beginning to end. In a modern investigation, the first hours after a crime are often considered the most valuable. Every movement matters. Every witness statement can become important. Every object left behind may contain information. But in 1887, detectives working the Raynham case faced a reality that was far more uncertain. They had arrived after the river had already taken its share. The Thames had carried away the simplest answers. There was no confirmed crime scene to examine. No room where investigators could determine what had happened. No immediate trail leading from a victim to a suspect. Instead, they were left with the final stage of an unknown sequence of events. Someone had died. Someone had hidden the evidence. Someone had hoped the river would keep the secret. The challenge was discovering what happened before that final moment. Investigators began examining every possibility. They considered whether the woman might have been killed close to the river, where disposal would have been easier. They considered whether the remains had been transported from another part of London. They looked at occupations that might provide access to tools, locations, and knowledge necessary to carry out such an act. But every theory faced the same problem. There was no person to connect it to. No witness had stepped forward. No missing person report clearly matched the victim. No suspicious individual had emerged. The investigation existed in a space between certainty and possibility. Medical examination became one of the few sources of information available. Victorian doctors and investigators lacked the scientific tools available today, but they carefully recorded what they observed. They studied the remains, estimated the victim's age, and attempted to determine details about her life before death. Their work was not simply an attempt to solve a puzzle. It was an attempt to return humanity to someone who had been stripped of it. Every observation mattered because every observation represented a possible connection. A physical characteristic could match a missing person. A medical detail could reveal whether the victim had experienced previous injuries. A small feature could become the one piece of information that allowed someone to recognize her. But no breakthrough came. The woman's identity remained hidden. As weeks passed, the case began to attract more attention. The unusual nature of the discovery made it difficult for the public to ignore. Newspapers reported developments, and conversations spread throughout London. People discussed the case in taverns, workplaces, and homes. The questions were always the same. Who was she? Who had done this? Could such a person be living among them? Fear often grows in the space created by uncertainty. When facts are limited, imagination fills the gaps. Rumors began circulating, and various explanations were suggested. Some believed the person responsible must have professional experience. Others suspected individuals who worked near the river. Some focused on medical knowledge, while others pointed toward occupations involving physical labor. Many theories were understandable. Few were supported by evidence. The difficulty was that the crime seemed to fit several possibilities without confirming any of them. A person familiar with anatomy might understand how to handle a body. A worker accustomed to knives might possess practical skills. Someone connected to the river might understand how to move objects unnoticed. But knowledge alone did not identify a suspect. Thousands of people in London possessed one or more of these characteristics. The investigation therefore remained trapped between two opposing realities. The offender appeared to have possessed unusual confidence. Yet that confidence had left almost no direct trace. This was what made the case so challenging. The crime seemed deliberate enough to suggest planning, but the planning itself had erased much of the evidence investigators needed. The city surrounding the investigation continued moving forward. People still crossed the bridges over the Thames. Ships continued arriving from distant ports. Markets opened each morning. Workers returned home exhausted each evening. The routines of ordinary life continued alongside a mystery that few people understood completely. That contrast would become one of the defining features of the Thames torso cases. The ordinary existing beside the extraordinary. The familiar streets containing unknown dangers. The possibility that someone capable of committing such a crime could still walk among thousands of unsuspecting citizens. Yet for all the fear and speculation, one fact remained at the center of the investigation. A woman had lost her life. Before she became a case file, before newspapers described the circumstances surrounding her death, she had been a person with a history that had almost completely disappeared. That absence weighed heavily on the investigation. Solving a murder is not only about finding the person responsible. It is also about restoring a victim's place in the world. It is about discovering where they came from, who knew them, and what was taken away. In the Raynham case, investigators could not complete that task. The woman remained unnamed. Her family, if she had one, remained unknown. Her final days remained hidden. The mystery surrounding her death became inseparable from the mystery surrounding her life. And then, as London moved deeper into the late 1880s, another terrible development would challenge the belief that Raynham was an isolated tragedy. The city would soon face another discovery. Another victim. Another set of unanswered questions. The possibility that investigators feared most began to emerge. Perhaps they were not searching for one crime. Perhaps they were searching for a pattern. The possibility of a pattern is one of the most difficult moments in any criminal investigation. A single tragedy can be explained as an individual act. A terrible decision. A personal conflict. A crime born from circumstances that may never happen again. But when similarities begin appearing across separate cases, the meaning changes. The question is no longer only, what happened? The question becomes, who else might be in danger? For the investigators who examined the remains recovered from the Thames, that possibility remained in the background. They had no way of knowing what the future would bring, But the circumstances surrounding the Raynham discovery created an uneasiness that would not easily disappear. The woman found in the river was not simply another victim of a city accustomed to tragedy. The manner in which she had been concealed suggested an offender who understood the importance of preventing identification. Whoever had done this had not left behind a simple accident or an impulsive act. The evidence pointed toward decisions made after the victim was already gone. That distinction changed the investigation. Detectives were not only searching for someone who had committed violence. They were searching for someone who had attempted to control what happened afterward. Control is often the hidden element behind many crimes. It appears not only in the act itself but in the choices that follow, hiding evidence, misleading others, creating distance between the offender and the victim. In the Raynham case, the separation between the victim and her identity became one of the most disturbing aspects. The killer had not only taken a life. They had attempted to erase the person who had lived it. For investigators in Victorian London, this created an almost impossible challenge. They were trying to reconstruct a human story from what remained after someone else had deliberately removed the most recognizable pieces. A name. A face. A personal connection. The absence of those things turned the investigation into a search through shadows. And yet, the city itself continued to provide clues, not necessarily clues about the offender, but about the environment in which such a crime could occur. London was enormous, but it was not evenly visible. Some areas were carefully watched. Government buildings, wealthy neighborhoods, and commercial centers received constant attention. Police patrols were frequent. Residents knew one another. Suspicious activity was more likely to be noticed. Other areas operated differently. Near the docks and industrial districts, movement was constant. Workers arrived and left at all hours. Strangers were common. Goods were loaded and unloaded day and night. A person carrying a package rarely attracted unusual attention because the entire area was built around transportation and labor. In such an environment, concealment did not always require secrecy. Sometimes it required only appearing ordinary. This reality made the Thames a particularly significant element of the case. The river connected places that were physically close but socially very different. A person could move from crowded industrial areas to quieter stretches of water without drawing attention. The same currents that carried valuable cargo could also carry away evidence. The Thames belonged to everyone. And because it belonged to everyone, it was difficult for anyone to control. For generations, Londoners had developed a complicated relationship with the river. It represented opportunity, employment, and trade. It was essential to the city's success. But it also represented danger. People drowned in its waters. Accidents occurred along its banks. The river absorbed the consequences of a city growing faster than it could manage. The Raynham discovery added another layer to that uneasy relationship. The Thames was no longer only a place where tragedy accidentally occurred. It had become a place where someone had intentionally attempted to hide tragedy. As investigators continued their work, they faced another painful reality. Even if they discovered the identity of the victim, they still had to determine who might have had a reason to harm her. Without knowing her relationships, her occupation, or her final movements, the investigation had no obvious direction. A victim's life often provides the first map for understanding a crime. Who knew them? Who saw them last? Who might have had a conflict with them? Who benefited from their disappearance? But without a name, there was no map. Only a blank page. This was why the search for identity became so important. Investigators were not simply trying to satisfy public